Illyra's hand froze on the cold brass handle of the study door. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Through the narrow gap where the wood had not quite sealed shut, she heard words that made her blood turn to ice. The voice belonged to Cale, the Alpha King, and he was not speaking to her. He did not know she was there at all. "The crown goes to Seraphine," he said, his tone flat, deliberate, the voice of a man closing a business deal, rather than choosing the person who would share his throne and his bed for the rest of his life. "It has to be her. If the truth about my birth ever reaches the council, this kingdom burns. Marrying into the strongest bloodline left in the north is the only shield I have." Illyra's fingers tightened around the frame of the door until her knuckles turned pale. She had come to the study for nothing more than a lost embroidery needle, a small errand that would have taken 30 seconds on any other night. Instead, she was standing frozen in the dark hallway, listening to a secret so dangerous it could unravel an entire kingdom, spoken by the one man in the world who could never know she had heard it. She wanted to step back. Every instinct told her to move, to retreat into the shadows before Edwin, the king's beta and closest advisor, opened that door and found her standing there, like a thief caught mid-crime. But her legs would not obey. She stayed rooted in place, straining to catch every word, because some part of her, some reckless and hungry part she did not like to admit existed, needed to know exactly what kind of fire she had just walked into. "You cannot keep pretending Seraphine is a political choice, and nothing more," Edwin said quietly. "The pack sees the way you look at her sister instead." Silence. A long, heavy silence that told Illyra everything Cale's words never could. Her heart slammed once, hard, against her ribs, and she pressed her free hand flat against her chest, as though she could physically hold the sound in. "That is exactly why it cannot be her," Cale finally answered, his voice lower now, rougher at the edges. "A king cannot rule from weakness, and what I feel is a weakness I do not have the luxury to indulge." Illyra did not wait to hear more. She turned, careful to keep her boots silent against the stone floor, and slipped back down the corridor the way she had come, her pulse hammering so loudly in her ears that she was certain someone, anyone, would hear it and know exactly what she had just done. She reached her bedroom and shut the door behind her, sliding down against it until she was sitting on the cold floor with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever secret lived behind Cale's carefully guarded eyes was none of her business, that she was nobody, a second daughter, with no title and no claim to anything beyond the shadow her sister cast. But the words would not leave her. "A king cannot rule from weakness. What I feel is a weakness I do not have the luxury to indulge." He had not been talking about strategy. He had been talking about her. Sleep did not come that night, not in any real sense. Illyra lay staring at the ceiling of her small room on the east wing, listening to the manor settle and creak around her, imagining every possible outcome of what she had overheard. If Cale discovered she had listened at his door, there was no telling what he would do to protect the secret buried in his bloodline. Kings had silenced far less for far smaller truths. And even if he never found out, she would still have to sit across from her sister at breakfast, at dinner, at the engagement ceremony that was surely coming, and pretend she did not know that the marriage being celebrated was built on a lie wrapped around a much larger lie. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the windows, Illyra had made a decision that frightened her more than the secret itself. She was not going to tell Seraphine. She was not going to confront Cale. She was going to leave, quietly, before anyone in the manor woke and noticed she was gone, and she was going to keep walking until the distance between herself and Draven Manor was wide enough that the secret could not follow her home. She moved through her room with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent her whole life making herself small enough not to be noticed. A canvas bag from beneath her bed, 2 dresses, plain and sturdy, nothing that would mark her as anything but an ordinary traveler. A worn leather pouch holding the handful of silver coins she had saved from years of small errands nobody else wanted to run. A woolen cloak with a deep hood. She packed with steady hands, even though her mind was racing, even though every rustle of fabric sounded like thunder in the silence of the sleeping house. She paused only once, at her door, looking back at the small room that had been hers for as long as she could remember. Somewhere down the hall, Seraphine was sleeping peacefully, unaware that the life she thought she was walking into had a crack running straight through its foundation. Alira felt a pang of guilt sharp enough to make her hesitate, her hand hovering over the door handle. But guilt was a luxury too, and she had already decided she could not afford it, any more than Cale could afford weakness. The manor at that hour was a maze of long, dark hallways, lit only by the last dying embers of hearth fires no one had bothered to stoke. Alira moved through them like a ghost, keeping close to the walls, avoiding the floorboards she knew from years of quiet observation tended to creak. She passed the kitchen, where the scent of last night's bread still lingered, and the grand staircase, where a portrait of Cale's late father watched her with painted eyes that seemed, for one unsettling moment, to follow her across the room. The side door near the stables was unguarded at this hour, as it always was, since the manor's true defenses lay in the pack of shifters who patrolled the outer grounds rather than any locked door. Alira slipped through it into the cold morning air, her breath fogging in front of her face, and for a moment she simply stood there, letting the shock of open sky and open space settle over her like a second cloak. She did not run. Running would draw attention, would look like exactly what it was. Instead she walked, steady and purposeful, toward the tree line at the edge of the estate, the same path she had walked 100 times before, on errands that meant nothing. This time, each step felt like it carried the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The forest beyond Draven Manor was old and quiet, its canopy thick enough to swallow the coming sunrise into a soft gray twilight. Alira had walked these woods since she was a child, first with her father, later alone, and she knew the paths well enough to move through them without stopping to think. She kept to the narrower trails, the ones used by hunters and traders, rather than the main road, because the main road was watched by patrols loyal to the crown, and the last thing she needed was to be recognized before she had gone even a mile. An hour into her walk, the sun finally broke over the horizon, spilling gold light through the gaps in the trees. Alira allowed herself a single glance back the way she had come, back toward the manor she could no longer see through the dense growth of pine and oak. She thought of Seraphine, sleeping soundly, still believing her future was a gift rather than a shield. She thought of Cale, and the low, rough edge in his voice when Edwin had pushed him about his feelings. She pushed both thoughts down, deep, and kept walking. By mid-morning, hunger had begun to gnaw at her, sharp and insistent, a reminder that she had left without eating, and without any real plan beyond simply putting distance between herself and everything she knew. She stopped at a stream to refill her water skin and to eat a small portion of the dried meat and bread she had packed, sitting on a flat gray stone with her knees drawn up, listening to the water rush over rocks worn smooth by centuries of the same patient motion. It was there, crouched by the stream with her hands cupped around cool water, that she first felt it. A prickling at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Alira went still, every muscle in her body locking into place, her eyes scanning the tree line without turning her head, the way her father had taught her years ago. Whoever it was, they were good. She could not see a single branch out of place, not a shadow shifting where it should not be, but the feeling did not fade. She rose slowly, tucking her water skin back into her bag, and resumed walking, as though nothing had happened, though her heart was now beating a fast, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She did not know if the watcher was a patrol sent from the manor, already aware of her absence, or something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with Cale or his secret at all. Either possibility was enough to make her quicken her pace. The trail she followed eventually widened into a rougher road, rutted from cartwheels, leading toward the loose collection of villages that made up the neutral border territory, land that belonged to no single pack and answered to no single crown. It was there, in the space between kingdoms, that Alira intended to disappear, a place where no one asked questions about where you came from, as long as you were willing to work. She reached the edge of the border town by late afternoon, her feet aching inside her worn boots, her cloak dusted with the dry dirt of the road. The town, if it could be called that, was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings, leaning against each other for support, a market square filled with traders, calling out prices in half a dozen dialects, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, striking metal in a steady, unhurried rhythm. It smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the particular mustiness of animals kept too close to living quarters. Alira found a small inn near the edge of the square, its sign so weathered she could barely make out the painted image of a fox that had once given the place its name. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, barely looked up from the ledger she was writing in when Elira approached. "Looking for a room or looking for work?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the particular bluntness of someone who had seen every kind of traveler pass through her door and had long since stopped being curious about any of them. "Both, if you have need of extra hands," Elira said, keeping her voice steady, keeping her eyes down in the manner of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The woman studied her for a moment, longer than Elira liked, her gaze sweeping over the fine stitching on Elira's cloak, the calluses on her palms that spoke of someone who worked but did not labor, the way she held herself with a straight back despite clear exhaustion. Whatever conclusions the woman drew, she kept them to herself. "Name's Nora. I run this place alone since my husband passed, and my hands aren't what they used to be. You can have a room in exchange for helping in the kitchen and keeping the floors clean. Fair trade, if you ask me." "That sounds more than fair," Elira said, and for the first time since she had slipped out of the manor before dawn, something in her chest loosened, just slightly. A room, a task, a place to disappear into for a while, until she figured out what came next. She gave Nora a false name, one she had settled on somewhere along the dusty road, simple and forgettable. Nora did not question it, and Elira understood immediately that this was a place where false names were common enough not to invite suspicion, a small mercy in a day that had offered her very few. That night, lying on a narrow cot in a room barely large enough to hold it, Elira listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the border town settling into darkness, the murmur of voices from the common room below, the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. She thought of the secret still lodged in her chest, like a stone she could not swallow or spit out. She thought of the sensation of being watched by the stream, and wondered again whether it had been real, or simply the product of a mind stretched thin with fear. She did not yet know that Cale had discovered her absence within an hour of the manor waking, that he had gone still and white-faced when Edwin brought him the news, that he had immediately understood, with a certainty that turned his blood cold, exactly what she must have heard. She did not know that he had sent for his brother Ronan before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, giving him a single instruction, delivered in a voice none of the household staff had ever heard him use before: "Find her, before anyone else does, and bring her home safely, whatever it costs." She only knew that she had left before dawn, carrying a secret too large for her own shoulders, and that whatever came next, she would face it as a stranger in a strange town, with nothing but a false name, and the growing, unshakable feeling that she had not seen the last of the world she had run from. The following morning, Elira woke before sunrise, out of old habit, the discipline of years spent rising early to avoid her sister's shadow, now serving a different purpose entirely. She helped Nora with the bread, kneading dough with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and nerves in equal measure, and tried to convince herself that this small, quiet life was one she could build a future inside of. But even as she worked, even as she smiled politely at the handful of early travelers who wandered into the inn for breakfast, some part of her remained alert, listening for footsteps that moved with purpose, rather than the aimless wandering of ordinary travelers, watching every new face that entered the square for some sign of recognition. She had left Draven Manor to escape a secret. She was only beginning to understand that the secret had left with her, and that some secrets, once carried, refuse to stay buried, no matter how far or how fast a person runs. She thought of the way Cale's voice had dropped when Edwin pressed him about his feelings, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether the man who ruled an entire kingdom with such calm authority ever allowed himself a single quiet moment to simply feel something without weighing its political cost. It was a strange thing to wonder about a king she had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in her life, mostly brief exchanges over tea trays and formal greetings, and yet the wondering persisted, stubborn and unwelcome, as she scrubbed the wooden floor of the inn until her arms ached and the sun climbed fully into the sky. By midday, the market square outside had filled with the noise of ordinary life continuing on, as though nothing in the world had changed, and Elira found a strange comfort in that ordinariness. Traders argued over prices, children chased each other between stalls. A man played a battered fiddle near the well, and a small crowd had gathered to listen, tossing coins into a cap at his feet. For a few hours, Elira allowed herself to simply exist inside that ordinary noise, to be nobody in particular, a woman with a false name wiping down tables in a border town inn. It would not last. She knew that even as she savored it. Somewhere behind her, the world she had left was already moving, already reaching for her, and no amount of quiet mornings kneading bread would change the fact that she carried something too dangerous to stay hidden for long. Ronan had been awake for less than an hour when his brother summoned him, and one look at Cale's face told him this was not a matter he could push aside for breakfast or explanation. The king stood at the window of his private chamber, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him, in a posture Ronan recognized from years of watching him manage crises no one else in the kingdom ever saw coming. But this time there was something different in the set of his shoulders, a tightness that had nothing to do with politics. "She's gone," Cale said, without turning around. "Elira. She left sometime before dawn. No note, no explanation, nothing taken but a change of clothes and whatever coin she had saved." Ronan frowned, leaning against the doorframe, with the easy confidence that had always separated him from his more serious older brother. "People leave manors all the time, Cale. Servants get restless. Maybe she wanted to visit family. She has no family beyond her sister, and her sister is still asleep in her chambers, completely unaware." Cale finally turned, and Ronan saw something in his eyes he had rarely witnessed there before. Fear, plain and unguarded. "I need you to find her, quietly, before anyone else realizes she's missing, and certainly before word reaches beyond these walls." "Why does it matter so much?" Ronan asked, though something in his gut already suspected the answer would not be a simple one. Cale was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ronan began to think he would not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, the voice of a man confessing a truth he had carried alone for far too long. "Because I think she heard something last night that she was never meant to hear. Something about my father, about why the council can never learn the truth of how I came to sit on this throne." He paused, his jaw tightening. "If she heard what I fear she heard, then she isn't just a missing servant, Ronan. She's the only other person alive who knows something that could burn this kingdom to the ground if it fell into the wrong hands." Ronan straightened, all traces of his earlier ease gone. He had grown up beside Cale, had watched him carry the weight of the crown since their father's death with a steadiness that sometimes frightened Ronan more than it reassured him. He had never once seen his brother look as unsettled as he did now, standing in the gray morning light, with the truth of his own vulnerability laid bare. "I'll find her," Ronan said simply. "But Cale, if she runs because she's afraid of what you'll do to keep this quiet, that's a problem you created, not one I can track my way out of." Cale's expression flickered, something like guilt passing briefly across his features, before the mask of composure settled back into place. "I know. Find her first. We'll deal with everything else after." Ronan left within the hour, taking only a single horse, and the barest supplies, the kind of light, fast travel that suited a man who had spent years honing his skills as the pack's best tracker. He knew the northern woods better than almost anyone alive, had learned to read broken twigs and disturbed leaves the way scholars read books, and it did not take him long to find the place where Elira had slipped through the side gate near the stables, her small footprints pressed into the soft earth still damp with morning dew. He followed her trail through the forest with the patient, unhurried focus of a man who understood that speed without accuracy would only lose him more time in the end. She had kept to the narrower paths, he noted, the ones used by hunters rather than traders, which told him she knew these woods well, and had chosen her route with deliberate care, rather than blind panic. Whoever this woman was, she was not simply fleeing in a random direction. She had a plan, even if it was a desperate one. By midday, Ronan reached the stream where Elira had stopped to rest, and he crouched beside the flat gray stone where her footprints lingered longest, studying the ground with narrowed eyes. Something about the pattern of disturbed earth caught his attention, a second set of prints, lighter and more careful than Elira's own, circling the clearing at a distance that suggested someone had been watching her without approaching. Ronan's stomach tightened. If someone else was tracking her, someone who was not sent by the crown, then the situation was far more dangerous than his brother had let on. He examined the second set of tracks more closely, noting the particular wear pattern on the boot soles, a style favored by scouts from the eastern packs that had never fully accepted Cale's claim to the throne, and had spent years searching for any crack in his legitimacy they could use to their advantage. If word had somehow already reached them that something was amiss within Draven Manor, if they had somehow learned that a servant girl had fled in the night, carrying knowledge dangerous enough to shake the foundations of the kingdom, then Alira was not simply running from her own fears. She was being hunted by people with far worse intentions than Ronan or his brother. He pushed his horse harder after that, following the trail with renewed urgency, no longer content to simply track at a careful, measured pace. The road toward the border territories was the obvious destination for anyone hoping to disappear beyond the reach of any single crown, and Ronan reasoned that a woman as clearly resourceful as Alira had proven herself to be would have chosen exactly that path. Meanwhile, back within the walls of Draven Manor, Seraphine woke to a household unusually quiet, servants moving with careful, measured steps that suggested something was being deliberately kept from her. She dressed and made her way to the breakfast hall, expecting to find her sister already there setting out the morning tea, as she did every day without fail. Instead, she found an empty chair, an untouched teapot, and a silence among the staff that pricked at her instincts, like a splinter beneath skin. "Where is Alira?" she asked one of the younger maids, a girl named Ivy, who had always been fond of Alira's quiet kindness. Ivy's eyes darted toward the doorway before she answered, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "No one has seen her since last night, my lady. They say her room was empty this morning, and some of her things are gone." Seraphine felt something cold settle in her stomach, a sensation she could not immediately name. She and her sister had never been close in the way sisters in stories often were, their relationship shaped by years of unspoken competition, and the constant, unspoken weight of Seraphine's status as the favored daughter. But Alira had never once given her reason to think she might simply vanish, without a word, without even a note of explanation. She sought out Edwin, finding him in a hallway near the king's private study, his expression carefully neutral in the way that immediately told her he knew more than he intended to share. "Edwin, what happened to my sister? Where has she gone?" "I cannot say for certain, my lady," Edwin replied, his tone measured and diplomatic, the tone of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much truth to offer and how much to withhold. "The king has already sent someone to look into the matter. I'm certain there's a reasonable explanation." But Seraphine had grown up around men like Edwin, had learned to read the careful spaces between their words as fluently as she read the words themselves, and she understood immediately that whatever had happened, it was connected somehow to the king, to the marriage she was meant to enter into, to the quiet tension she had felt building around her for weeks, without being able to name its source. She found Cale in the great hall an hour later, standing before the long table where the council would soon gather for their weekly meeting, his expression unreadable in the way it always was when he was holding something back. Seraphine approached without hesitation, her voice steady despite the unease churning beneath her calm exterior. "My sister is missing," she said, watching his face carefully. "And you already knew before I did. What happened, Cale? What are you not telling me?" For a long moment, Cale said nothing, and in that silence, Seraphine felt the first true crack form in the careful picture she had built of her future. A picture of a strong, capable king who would provide stability and purpose to a life she had never fully chosen for herself. When he finally spoke, his answer offered no real comfort. "I don't know exactly why she left, Seraphine, but I intend to find out, and I intend to bring her home safely. I give you my word on that." It was not a lie, not exactly, but it was far from the whole truth, and Seraphine had lived long enough within the walls of political marriages and careful diplomacy to recognize the difference. She said nothing more, only nodded once, and turned to walk away, her mind already turning over the pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve, whether or not the king intended to share the full picture with her. The border town did not sleep so much as it simply grew quieter, the market stalls closing one by one as evening settled over the rooftops, the fiddle player packing away his instrument, the last of the day's traders leading their carts back toward whatever distant villages they called home. Elira spent her second evening at the Fox and Ember scrubbing pots in the small kitchen behind the common room, her hands raw from hot water and harsh soap, her mind still circling the same worries that had followed her every step of the journey. Nora worked beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally humming some old tune under her breath, and Elira found herself grateful for the older woman's easy manner, the way she asked no questions beyond what was strictly necessary. It was a kindness Elira had not expected to find so quickly, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a version of her life where this quiet border town became a permanent home rather than a temporary hiding place. The illusion shattered the moment she stepped outside, to empty a bucket of dirty water into the alley behind the inn. The night air was cool and still, carrying the distant sound of laughter from the common room and the soft rustle of wind through the eaves. But beneath those familiar sounds, Alira caught something else, a stillness in the shadows, near the far end of the alley, that felt deliberate rather than natural, the particular quality of silence that comes from someone holding their breath. She set the bucket down slowly, her heart beginning to race, and forced herself to walk back toward the inn's door without breaking into a run, without giving whoever was watching any sign that she had noticed them at all. Her hand had barely closed around the door handle when a voice spoke from the darkness behind her, low and unfamiliar. "You've made yourself difficult to find, for someone who left in such a hurry." Alira spun around, her back pressing against the rough wood of the door, and found herself facing a man she had never seen before, tall and lean, with the kind of watchful stillness that immediately marked him as something other than an ordinary traveler. His eyes, pale and sharp even in the dim light, studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even as her mind raced through every possible escape route, every distance between herself and the safety of the inn's common room, just beyond the door. The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "No need to pretend, Alira. My employers have been very interested in the sudden disappearance of a young woman from Draven Manor, particularly one who left the very same night the Alpha King held a rather sensitive conversation behind closed doors." Her blood ran cold. Whoever this man worked for, they already knew far more than she had hoped anyone outside the manor could possibly know. She thought fast, weighing her options in the space of a single racing heartbeat. She could scream, could bring Nora and whatever patrons remained in the common room rushing to investigate, but something told her this man would not hesitate to silence her before help arrived if he believed she was about to expose him. "I don't know what conversation you're referring to," she said carefully, taking a slow step to the side, positioning herself closer to the alley's mouth, where the market square opened into wider, more populated space. "You have the wrong person." "I don't think I do." The man's smile widened, and he took a matching step forward, closing the distance she had tried to create. "My employers would very much like to speak with you about what you overheard. They can offer you protection, resources, a life far more comfortable than scrubbing pots in a border town inn. All you'd need to do is share what you know." "And if I refuse?" The man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened, a coldness that told Alira exactly how this conversation would end if she did not find a way out of it quickly. "Then we'll have to find other ways to convince you. My employers are patient people, Alira. But their patience has limits, and so, I'm afraid, does mine." She did not wait for him to say anything further. In one swift motion, she turned and bolted toward the market square, her boots pounding against packed dirt, her lungs burning, as she pushed herself faster than she had ever run in her life. Behind her, she heard the man curse and give chase, his footsteps closing the distance with alarming speed, the kind of speed that told her he was not entirely human, that whatever pack he belonged to had gifted him with strength and quickness far beyond ordinary limits. The square, when she reached it, was nearly empty, most of the traders long gone for the evening, only a handful of stragglers lingering near the well where the fiddle player had performed earlier. Alira's mind raced through her limited options, knowing she could not outrun a shifter for long, knowing that her only real hope lay in reaching some form of help before her pursuer caught up to her. She was still calculating her next move when a second figure emerged from the shadows near the blacksmith shop, moving with the same unnatural speed as the man chasing her, but angling not toward Alira, instead placing himself directly between her and her pursuer. Alira skidded to a stop, uncertain whether this new arrival represented rescue or simply a second threat she had not anticipated. "That's far enough," the newcomer said, his voice carrying an authority that made even her original pursuer hesitate. He was broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that, in the dim lantern light of the square, held a familiar shape, a resemblance Alira could not quite place in the chaos of the moment. Her pursuer's confident expression faltered, just slightly, as he studied the man now blocking his path. "This isn't your concern. I'm making it my concern." The stranger's tone remained level, almost calm. but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it, the promise of violence held carefully in check. Walk away now, and we can both pretend this encounter never happened. For a tense moment, neither man moved, the air between them thick with the kind of stillness that precedes sudden, explosive action. Alira held her breath, pressed back against the cool stone of the well, watching the standoff with wide, frightened eyes. Then, without warning, her original pursuer turned and melted back into the shadows of the alley from which he had emerged, apparently deciding that whatever reward his employers offered was not worth the risk of confronting whoever had just intervened. Only once the man was gone did the stranger turn to face Alira fully, and it was then, in the better light of the square's lanterns, that she finally placed the resemblance that had nagged at her moments before. The same strong jaw, the same steady, watchful eyes she had seen countless times across a dinner table at Draven Manor. "You're his brother," she said quietly, understanding, dawning with a mixture of relief and renewed fear. "Ronan, you know who I am." Ronan studied her with open curiosity, tilting his head slightly. "That makes this easier, I suppose. Kale sent me to find you." Alira felt her earlier relief curdle immediately into fresh alarm. "I'm not going back. That man who just tried to grab you clearly disagrees with your plan to disappear quietly," Ronan said, glancing toward the alley where her pursuer had vanished. "Whoever he works for, they already know far more than they should. You're not safe out here alone, Alira, whatever you think you're running from." "I know exactly what I'm running from," she snapped, fear making her voice sharper than she intended. "And going back to Draven Manor doesn't make it safer, it makes it worse." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had softened, just slightly, losing some of its earlier command. "Then let me help you figure out a way through this that doesn't end with you dead in some border town alley. Because that's exactly where you were headed 30 seconds ago, whether you want to admit it or not." Alira said nothing, her chest still heaving from the chase, her mind spinning through the sudden unwelcome truth that the quiet life she had hoped to build in this small border town had already collapsed around her, undone by a secret that had followed her far faster and far more dangerously than she had ever anticipated. Ronan led her away from the square, keeping to the darker edges of the street where lantern light did not reach, his pace quick but controlled, clearly practiced at moving unseen through unfamiliar territory. Alira followed, still trying to steady her breathing, still trying to make sense of the last few minutes. The sudden violence of a stranger's threat followed immediately by the equally sudden appearance of someone from the very life she had fled. "We can't stay here," Ronan said quietly, glancing back over his shoulder as they walked. "If that man found you this quickly, others will follow. Whoever hired him will send more, and they won't be as easily discouraged a second time." "Where are we supposed to go?" Alira asked, exhaustion beginning to seep into her voice now that the immediate danger had passed. "I can't go back to the manor, Ronan. You don't understand what I heard." "Then tell me," he said, stopping abruptly and turning to face her fully, his expression serious in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of his brother. "Because right now I'm operating on nothing but Kale's panic and a stranger who clearly believes you're carrying something worth chasing you across kingdom lines for. If you want my help, you need to tell me what I'm actually protecting you from." Alira hesitated, old instincts warring with the very real danger she had just narrowly escaped. But the truth was, she had no allies in this border town beyond Nora's quiet kindness, and Nora had no way to protect her from shifters with unnatural speed and clear intent to capture her by force. Ronan, whatever his loyalties to his brother, had just placed himself between her and real danger, without hesitation. "Your brother is hiding something about his birth," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper even though the street around them was empty. "Something that would threaten his claim to the throne, if the council ever learned the truth. That's why he's marrying my sister, instead of choosing based on anything close to affection. It's a shield, not a partnership." Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alira thought she saw something like recognition flicker across his features, as though her words confirmed a suspicion he had carried for a long time, without ever voicing it aloud. "You're certain of this?" "I heard him say it myself, to Edwin, in his study, 2 nights ago." Alira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening air. "I wasn't trying to listen. I was looking for a lost needle, and I heard voices, and I couldn't make myself walk away, once I understood what they were talking about. And now half the Eastern Packs apparently know you overheard something, Ronan said grimly, running a hand through his dark hair. That complicates things considerably. How would they even know? Illyra asked, the question that had been nagging at her since the confrontation in the alley, finally finding voice. I told no one. I left before anyone in the manor woke. Ronan's expression darkened further. Someone within the manor itself must have noticed something, or overheard something similar, and sold that information rather than keeping it quiet. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Which means Kale has a leak somewhere among his own household, someone willing to trade the kingdom's stability for coin from outside interests. The implications settled over both of them heavily. If someone within Draven Manor had betrayed Kale's trust, then the danger extended far beyond Illyra's own flight into the border territories. It meant Seraphine, too, remained vulnerable, unknowingly engaged to a king whose enemies were already circling closer than anyone realized. We need to move, Ronan said finally, glancing once more down the darkened street. There's a safe house 2 hours from here, a place my brother's most trusted allies use when they need to disappear quietly. It's not comfortable, but it's secure, and it will buy us time to figure out our next steps without worrying about strangers finding you in dark alleys. Illyra wanted to argue, wanted to insist on continuing alone, on trusting no one connected to Draven Manor with her safety. But the memory of the pale-eyed stranger's cold smile, the promise of violence in his voice when he spoke of his employer's patience running out, was still fresh enough to override her instinct towards stubborn independence. She nodded once, tightly, and allowed Ronan to lead her away from the square, back toward the edge of town where 2 horses waited, tethered and ready, exactly as though he had anticipated needing a fast escape from the very beginning. They rode through the night, the border town fading behind them into darkness, the forest closing in around the narrow trail Ronan chose with obvious familiarity. Illyra, unaccustomed to long hours on horseback, felt every muscle in her body protest the pace, but she said nothing, focusing instead on staying upright and alert, watching the shadows on either side of the trail for any sign of pursuit. You're worried someone is still following us, she said eventually, breaking the long silence between them. I'm always worried someone is following me, Ronan replied without turning his head. It's kept me alive this long. But that man in the alley, whoever sent him, they'll regroup and try again. We just need to be gone before they figure out our new direction. The safe house, when they finally reached it well past midnight, turned out to be a small stone cottage tucked into a fold of the hills, invisible from the main trail unless a person knew exactly where to look. Ronan dismounted first, moving with the same watchful caution he had shown since the moment he intervened in the alley, checking the surrounding tree line before finally gesturing for Illyra to follow him inside. The interior was sparse but clean, a single main room with a stone hearth, a small table, and 2 narrow cots pushed against opposite walls. Ronan lit a fire while Illyra sank gratefully onto one of the cots, her whole body aching from the ride, her mind still spinning from everything that had happened since sunset. You should rest, Ronan said, settling into a chair near the fire, his posture still alert despite the apparent security of their hiding place. We'll figure out the rest in the morning, once we've both had time to think clearly. What happens now? Illyra asked quietly, staring at the flickering firelight rather than at him. Even if we're safe here for tonight, this doesn't change anything. Your brother still has a secret worth killing to protect. My sister is still engaged to a man who sees her as a shield rather than a partner. And whoever hired that man in the alley is still out there, still looking for me. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire with an expression Illyra could not quite read. I don't have easy answers for any of that, he admitted finally. But I know my brother, Illyra. Whatever mistakes he's made and how he's handled this, he's not a cruel man. If you're willing to hear him out, I think there's a version of this that doesn't end with you running for the rest of your life, and doesn't end with your sister trapped in a marriage built on a lie. And if I'm not willing to hear him out, then I'll help you disappear properly, Ronan said simply. Somewhere no one connected to Draven Manor or its enemies will ever think to look. But I don't think that's really what you want, is it? You didn't just run because you were afraid. You ran because you didn't know who to trust with what you knew. That's different. Illyra did not answer immediately, turning his words over in her mind, testing them against the fear and exhaustion still coursing through her body. He was not entirely wrong, she realized, though admitting it felt like conceding ground she was not yet ready to give up. She had run not simply out of fear for her own safety, but out of a deeper uncertainty about what kind of world she wanted to help build, and whether staying silent about the truth she carried made her complicit in a lie that would eventually hurt people she cared about. "I need to sleep," she said finally, which was not quite an answer, but was the only honest thing she could offer in that moment. Ronan nodded, understanding, and turned his attention back to the fire, leaving her to the quiet, exhausted darkness of her own thoughts, as sleep finally, mercifully, began to pull her under. Seraphine spent the days following her sister's disappearance in a state of quiet, methodical investigation that surprised even herself. She had never considered herself particularly clever, had spent most of her life content to let others make decisions on her behalf. First her father, then increasingly, the expectations of a pack eager to see her married into the crown's favor. But watching Kale's careful evasions, watching the servants exchange nervous glances whenever her sister's name arose, something had shifted inside her, a stubborn refusal to simply accept the comfortable ignorance she had been offered. She began with Ivy, the young maid who had first told her of Alira's disappearance, coaxing small details from the girl over the following days with patient, gentle questions that never pushed too hard all at once. Ivy revealed that she had seen Alira leave the kitchens unusually late 2 nights before her disappearance, carrying nothing more than a lit candle, heading in the direction of the private wing where the king's study was located. The detail seemed small, insignificant on its own, but Seraphine filed it away carefully, adding it to the growing collection of fragments she was assembling into some larger picture she did not yet fully understand. She sought out Edwin next, approaching him not with direct accusation, but with the kind of careful, roundabout conversation that had always been her particular skill, honed through years of navigating pack politics and social maneuvering. "You've served my future husband a long time," she said one afternoon, finding Edwin alone in the manor's small library, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence he was clearly reviewing, with the focused intensity of a man trying to distract himself from larger worries. "I imagine there's very little that happens within these walls that escapes your notice." Edwin looked up from his papers with the wary expression of a man who understood exactly what kind of conversation was being initiated, even if the opening words had been carefully mild. "I try to serve the king's interests as best I can, my lady." "Then perhaps you can help me understand something." Seraphine settled into the chair across from him, her posture relaxed even as her mind worked carefully through each word, before speaking it aloud. "My sister has never once, in her entire life, done anything without careful thought behind it. She isn't the type to simply vanish on impulse. Which means whatever drove her to leave before dawn, without so much as a note to explain herself, must have been something significant enough to override every instinct toward caution she's ever shown me." Edwin's expression remained carefully neutral, but Seraphine noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his posture that told her she had struck closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. "I couldn't say what drove her decision, my lady. I wasn't privy to her private thoughts." "No," Seraphine agreed, watching him closely. "But you were privy to whatever conversation happened in the king's study 2 nights before she disappeared, weren't you? Ivy saw her heading in that direction, carrying a candle late at night. And you've been unusually careful in every conversation we've had since, choosing your words like a man navigating a minefield, rather than simply answering honest questions." For a long moment, Edwin said nothing, his jaw working as though weighing the cost of honesty against his loyalty to the king. Finally, he set down his pen and met her eyes directly, something like weary resignation settling over his features. "I think you deserve better than the careful evasions I've been offering you, my lady, though it isn't my place to reveal what isn't mine to share. What I will say is this: whatever your sister may have overheard, it wasn't intended maliciously toward you. The king's decisions regarding this marriage have never been about a lack of respect for you personally. They've been about protecting something far larger than either of you, something that predates your engagement entirely." "Protecting what, exactly?" Edwin shook his head slowly. "That truly isn't mine to tell. But I will say this much, because I think it matters for whatever choices you make going forward. If you truly want to understand what drove your sister away, you should ask the king directly, and press him harder than you have been. He respects you more than his careful silence might suggest, and I believe, Given enough pressure, he would rather you know the truth than continue building a marriage on a foundation of careful lies. Seraphine left the library with more questions than she had arrived with, but also with a growing certainty that whatever secret lay at the heart of this situation, it was significant enough to threaten not just her own future, but the stability of the entire kingdom. She thought of Cale's careful, controlled demeanor, the way he had always seemed slightly guarded even in their most intimate conversations, as though holding some part of himself permanently in reserve. She found him that evening in the private garden behind the manor's east wing, a space he retreated to often when the weight of ruling grew too heavy to carry within the formal walls of the great hall. He stood near a small stone fountain, his back to her, his shoulders carrying a tension she had learned to recognize over the months of their courtship. "I want the truth, Cale," she said without preamble, walking up beside him. "Not the careful, diplomatic version you've been offering everyone since my sister disappeared. The actual truth about what she overheard, and why it frightened her enough to run, rather than come to either of us directly." Cale turned to face her, and in the fading evening light, Seraphine saw an exhaustion in his expression that surprised her, a weariness that went far deeper than the immediate crisis of a missing servant girl. "Are you certain you want to know? Once I tell you, there's no taking that knowledge back." "I'm certain," Seraphine said firmly, though her heart was pounding beneath her calm exterior. "I would rather understand exactly what I'm walking into than continue pretending everything between us is simple and uncomplicated." Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, something between respect and reluctance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced authority she was accustomed to hearing from him in council meetings or formal gatherings. It was quieter, rawer, the voice of a man setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. "My father was not my true father," he said simply. "The man the kingdom remembers as the previous Alpha King, the man whose portrait hangs in our grand staircase, was not the one who fathered me. My mother had an affair, decades ago, with a man from outside our pack entirely, someone whose bloodline would never have been accepted as legitimate heirs to this throne. When I was born, my father, the man I called father my entire life, chose to raise me as his own, rather than expose my mother's betrayal, and risk the stability of the kingdom, during a particularly fragile period of our history." Seraphine felt the weight of his words settle over her slowly, understanding, beginning to dawn even as new questions multiplied in its wake. "And if the council learned this truth, they would have grounds to challenge my legitimacy entirely," Cale finished for her, his voice bitter. "Everything I've built, every alliance I've forged, every peace I've maintained between our packs and the surrounding territories, all of it would collapse under the weight of a truth I had no control over, and never asked to inherit. Marrying you, joining our bloodlines, was meant to create a claim to this throne strong enough that even if the truth ever surfaced, no one could challenge my right to rule, without also challenging yours. So I was never truly a choice made from affection," Seraphine said quietly, though there was less hurt in her voice than she might have expected. More a simple acknowledgement of a truth she had perhaps always sensed beneath the surface of their careful courtship. "I never wanted to lie to you about that," Cale said, and for the first time since she had known him, she heard genuine regret in his voice. "But I convinced myself that protecting the kingdom mattered more than being honest with you about my reasons. I see now how much damage that choice has already caused, how it drove Alira to run rather than trust either of us with what she'd overheard." Seraphine absorbed his words in silence, her mind already turning toward the larger implications of everything she now understood. Her sister was somewhere out in the world, carrying a secret dangerous enough to threaten a kingdom, likely terrified and alone, having chosen flight over confrontation, because neither Seraphine nor Cale had given her reason to believe the truth would be met with anything other than punishment or fear. "We need to find her," Seraphine said finally, her voice firm, despite the storm of emotions still settling within her. "Not just because she's in danger from whatever forces might want to exploit this secret, but because she deserves better than to spend the rest of her life running from a truth that was never truly her burden to carry alone." Cale nodded, something like renewed determination replacing the exhaustion in his expression. "Ronan is already searching for her. I have faith he'll find her, before anyone with worse intentions does." "Then I want to help however I can," Seraphine said. "This affects my future as much as yours, Cale. I won't simply wait quietly in this manner while everything unfolds around me. For the first time since their conversation began, something like genuine respect flickered across Cale's features, and Seraphine understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever complicated future awaited them, it would at least be built on honesty from this point forward, a foundation far sturdier than the careful lies that had shaped their engagement until now. Alira woke to gray morning light, filtering through the cottage's single small window, her body stiff from the previous day's ride, her mind slower to catch up with the memory of everything that had happened since she fled Draven Manor. For a moment, disoriented, she simply lay still, listening to the quiet crackle of a fire someone had rebuilt while she slept, the soft sounds of Ronan moving about the small room, with the careful quiet of someone accustomed to letting others rest undisturbed. "There's tea if you want it," he said without turning, apparently aware she had woken despite not looking directly at her. "Not much else in the way of food here, but I'll ride out later to find something more substantial." Alira sat up slowly, testing her aching muscles, and accepted the offered cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Thank you, for last night. If you hadn't shown up when you did, you'd have found a way to handle it," Ronan said, though there was no real confidence behind the words, more an acknowledgement that dwelling on what might have happened served no useful purpose now. "But I'm glad I didn't have to find out whether that was true." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, before Ronan finally spoke again, his tone shifting into something more serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. The man who confronted you last night, did he give any indication of who he worked for? A name? A symbol? Anything that might help us understand exactly what we're dealing with?" Alira thought back through the tense confrontation, forcing herself to move past the fear and focus on the details. He mentioned employers, plural. Said they were patient people, but that their patience had limits, nothing more specific than that. Ronan's expression darkened, and he stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "There's only a handful of factions with both the resources and the motivation to send someone after you this quickly. My guess would be the Eastern Pax, led by a man named Damon, who has spent years looking for any weakness in Cale's claim to the throne. If word somehow reached him about what you overheard, he'd move heaven and earth to get that information for himself." "What would he do with it?" Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Use it to challenge Cale's legitimacy publicly, most likely. Or worse, use it as leverage to force concessions from the throne, under threat of exposure." Ronan's jaw tightened. Damon isn't a subtle man. If he gets his hands on proof of Cale's true parentage, he won't simply whisper it quietly to the council. He'll use it as a weapon, and the resulting chaos could tear the kingdom apart, especially with the neighboring pacts, already restless after years of uneasy peace. The weight of the situation settled over Alira with fresh clarity. She was no longer simply a frightened servant girl running from an uncomfortable truth. She had become, without ever choosing it, a piece in a much larger game, one where her safety mattered less to the players involved than the information she carried in her memory. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she said, thinking through the situation with a clearer head than she had managed the previous night. "If Damon's people tracked me this far already, they'll find this safe house eventually too." "Agreed," Ronan said. "I think our best option is to keep moving. Stay ahead of anyone searching for us, while I send word back to Cale about what's happened. He needs to know Damon is already involved, that this has moved beyond a simple missing person situation into something with real political consequences." They spent the remainder of the morning preparing to leave, Ronan packing supplies with the efficient economy of someone long accustomed to sudden departures, Alira helping where she could despite her continued exhaustion. It was nearing midday when the sound of approaching horses reached them, faint at first but growing steadily louder, several riders moving with purpose along the narrow trail leading toward the cottage. Ronan's expression shifted immediately into sharp alertness, and he moved to the small window, peering out carefully, while keeping himself hidden from view. "3 riders," he said quietly, moving fast, and not bothering to hide their approach, which either means they're confident in their numbers, or they don't yet know we're aware of them. "Damon's people?" Alira asked, her heart already racing. "Almost certainly." Ronan turned back to face her, his expression calculating. "We don't have time to outrun them on horseback, not with them already this close. We need another plan. He moved quickly to the cottage's rear wall, where a section of stone had been cleverly constructed to appear solid, but concealed a narrow passage leading down into what Alira realized must be some kind of escape tunnel, clearly built into the safe house's original design for exactly this kind of emergency. This leads to a ravine about half a mile from here. It's tight, and it won't be comfortable, but it's our best chance of getting clear before they realize we're not simply waiting inside for them to break down the door. Alira did not hesitate, following him into the narrow passage, as the sound of the approaching riders grew louder outside, hoofbeats now clearly audible even through the thick stone walls of the cottage. The tunnel was cramped and dark, forcing them to move in a low crouch, Ronan leading the way, with one hand trailing along the wall to guide their path through the absolute darkness. They had covered perhaps a third of the tunnel's length when they heard the cottage door crash open above them, followed by voices calling out in the confident, aggressive tones of men, expecting to find their quarry, cornered and helpless. Alira froze, her breath catching, but Ronan's hand found her shoulder in the darkness, a silent reassurance urging her to keep moving, rather than allowing fear to root her in place. They emerged from the tunnel's far end into a narrow, rocky ravine, exactly as Ronan had described, the midday sun startlingly bright after the tunnel's absolute darkness. Ronan immediately began moving them along the ravine's floor, keeping low, keeping to whatever cover the uneven terrain offered, his ears clearly straining for any sound of pursuit from behind. "They'll realize we're gone soon enough," he said quietly as they moved. "We need to put as much distance between us and that cottage as possible before they figure out which direction we've taken." They pushed forward through the ravine for what felt like hours, though Alira's exhausted mind struggled to accurately track the passage of time, her legs burning with the effort of maintaining Ronan's relentless pace across uneven, rocky ground. When they finally paused to rest, tucked into a shadowed alcove, where the ravine's walls rose steeply on either side, Alira allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion in equal measure. "How much farther until we're actually safe?" she asked, unable to keep a note of desperate exhaustion from creeping into her voice. Ronan's expression, when he answered, held none of the reassurance she had hoped for. "I don't know that we'll be fully safe until Kale finds a way to neutralize whatever threat Damon poses, one way or another. But we can find somewhere more secure than an open ravine to regroup, at least. There's a village not far from here, larger than the border town, with enough people passing through that 2 more strangers won't draw much attention." Alira nodded wearily, pushing herself back to her feet despite every protest from her exhausted body. Whatever safety Ronan promised felt distant and uncertain, but the alternative, remaining still while Damon's men continued their search, was no option at all. She thought, briefly, of Seraphine, wondering whether her sister had discovered the truth yet, wondering whether Kale had finally found the courage to be honest about the secret that had set this entire dangerous chain of events into motion. There was no way to know from here, no way to reach out and offer reassurance or seek it in return. There was only the path ahead, uncertain and dangerous, and the growing understanding that she could not simply run from this truth forever, no matter how far or how fast she traveled. The village Ronan led them to by late afternoon was larger than the border town Alira had first fled to, its streets busier, its market square filled with the constant noise of trade and travel that made it easy for 2 more weary strangers to slip through unnoticed. They found a room above a tavern called the Weathered Horn, paying in coin rather than trading labor this time, a small luxury that allowed them the privacy to rest without the constant scrutiny of curious innkeepers. Alira collapsed onto the narrow bed the moment they reached their room, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had been holding at bay since the previous night's confrontation. Ronan took the chair near the window, positioning himself where he could watch the street below without being easily seen from outside, his vigilance apparently as tireless as it had been since the moment he first intervened in the border town's market square. "You should rest too," Alira murmured, watching him through heavy eyelids. "You haven't stopped moving since you found me." "I'll rest when I'm certain we're not about to be found again," Ronan replied, though there was a weariness in his own voice that suggested even his considerable stamina had limits. "Sleep. I'll wake you if anything changes." She did sleep, deeper and longer than she had expected given the circumstances, waking only when the light through the window had shifted from afternoon gold to the softer blue of early evening. Ronan remained in his chair, though his posture had relaxed slightly, and a small meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit sat waiting on the room's single small table. "You went out?" she asked, sitting up and reaching gratefully for the food. "Briefly. Wanted to gauge whether word of our arrival had spread, and to send a message to Kale, through a contact I trust in this village." Ronan's expression remained carefully neutral, but Alira had grown skilled enough at reading him over the past day to notice the tension still evident in his shoulders. "No sign of Damon's men here yet, but that doesn't mean we're safe. They'll widen their search eventually, and this village is exactly the kind of place they'd think to check." "So what's the plan?" Alira asked between bites, her strength slowly returning with the food and rest. "We wait for Kale's response, and in the meantime, we stay careful and stay ready to move again if necessary." Ronan hesitated, then added, "I also think it's time you understood something about why my brother reacted the way he did when he first learned you'd overheard his secret. It wasn't simply fear of political consequences, though those are real enough. It's tied to something that happened when we were younger, something that still shapes how he views trust and vulnerability." Alira set down the piece of bread she had been eating, giving him her full attention. "What happened?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When Kale was young, barely more than a boy, our mother's affair very nearly came to light through a different route entirely. A servant who worked closely with our mother discovered letters, evidence of the relationship, and threatened to expose everything unless she was paid a substantial sum to keep silent. Our father, the man Kale always believed was his true father, until the truth was finally explained to him at 16, paid the servant to protect the family's reputation. But the experience left a lasting mark on how our entire household approached questions of secrecy and trust. Kale learned very young that information, especially information about his true parentage, was something to be guarded fiercely, something that could be weaponized against him and everyone he cared about if it fell into the wrong hands." Alira absorbed this, understanding beginning to color her earlier anger and fear with something closer to empathy. "That doesn't excuse how he handled things with my sister, deciding her future based on political necessity rather than honesty." "No," Ronan agreed, "it doesn't excuse it. But I think it helps explain why his first instinct, upon learning you'd overheard his secret, was fear rather than trust. He spent his entire life believing that the truth of his birth is a weapon others will use against him the moment they learn it. He never considered that you might simply want to understand, rather than exploit what you'd heard." "I never wanted to exploit anything," Alira said quietly. "I just didn't know what else to do with knowledge, that dangerous. I panicked." "I know," Ronan said, and something gentle entered his voice that had not been there before. "For what it's worth, I don't think you made the wrong choice, running rather than confronting either of them directly. Given what you knew, given how little reason you had to trust that either my brother or your sister would react with anything other than fear or anger, leaving quietly was probably the safest option available to you at the time." Alira felt an unexpected warmth at his words, a small measure of validation, after days of uncertainty about whether her choices had been reckless rather than reasonable. "Thank you for saying that." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the tension of the day slowly easing into something more manageable, until a soft knock at the door startled them both back into alertness. Ronan moved quickly, positioning himself between Alira and the door, one hand resting near the hilt of the blade he carried at his belt. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice carrying none of the earlier warmth, all business and readiness now. "A message, sir. From the courier you spoke with earlier," came the muffled reply from the other side of the door, a young voice that sounded more nervous than threatening. Ronan opened the door carefully, keeping his body positioned to shield Alira from view, and accepted a small sealed letter from the boy waiting outside, before quickly closing the door again. He broke the seal with careful fingers, scanning the contents with an expression that shifted from cautious hope to something more complicated as he read. "What does it say?" Alira asked, watching him closely. "Kale knows about Damon's involvement now. He's mobilizing forces to intercept any of Damon's people operating within our territory, and he's asking us to make our way toward a meeting point 2 days from here, somewhere his own guard can provide proper protection." Ronan folded the letter carefully, his expression troubled despite the apparent good news. "He also says Seraphine knows the full truth now. He told her everything." Elira felt a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension at this news. Relief that Seraphine finally understood the situation, that she was no longer walking blindly into a marriage built entirely on unexplained secrets. Apprehension at what her sister's reaction might have been, at whether this revelation had damaged something between Seraphine and Cale that could never fully be repaired. "How did she take it?" Elira asked. "The letter doesn't say much beyond the fact that she knows, and that she's chosen to help search for you, rather than retreat from the situation entirely." Ronan's tone carried something like admiration. "That takes considerable strength, learning something like that about the man you're meant to marry, and choosing to face it head-on, rather than falling apart." Elira thought of her sister, always so composed, so capable of navigating the complicated social waters of pack politics, with a grace Elira had never quite managed to match herself. It did not entirely surprise her that Seraphine would meet this crisis with the same steady determination she brought to everything else in her life. 2 days, Elira repeated, turning her attention back to the practical matter of what came next. "Can we make it there safely, with Damon's people still searching for us?" "We'll need to be careful," Ronan admitted. "But staying static here carries its own risks, the longer we remain in one place. I think moving toward Cale's protection is our best option, provided we choose our route carefully and avoid the more obvious roads Damon's people would expect us to take." They spent the remainder of the evening planning their route, poring over a rough map Ronan produced from his supplies, marking out a path that wound through less traveled forest trails rather than the main roads connecting the villages along their route. It was careful, meticulous work, the kind that left little room for error, and Elira found herself grateful for Ronan's evident experience in exactly this kind of dangerous, high-stakes navigation. As the evening wore on and exhaustion began once again to pull at her, Elira found her thoughts drifting, unbidden, toward Cale himself, toward the secret that had set this entire chain of events into motion. She wondered what it must feel like, carrying the weight of a truth capable of unraveling everything he had built, and she wondered, too, whether the man she had glimpsed briefly through a cracked study door, vulnerable and honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be, might prove to be someone worth knowing beyond the careful, guarded persona he presented to the rest of his kingdom. It was a strange thought to hold on to amid the danger and uncertainty surrounding her, but as sleep finally began to claim her for the second time that day, Elira allowed herself, just briefly, to wonder what waited for her at the end of this dangerous journey, beyond simple survival, beyond the immediate threat of Damon's pursuit. She wondered whether there might be some version of the future ahead of her that held more than simply running, more than simply hiding from a truth too large to carry alone. They left the village before dawn, moving quickly through streets still shrouded in the gray half-light of early morning, before the market stalls had begun setting up, and before curious eyes had any real chance to mark their departure. Ronan set a steady pace along the forest trail he had chosen, one that avoided the main roads entirely, winding instead through dense woodland that offered cover at the cost of slower travel. The first day passed without incident, the forest quiet around them save for birdsong and the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves against soft earth. Elira found herself growing more comfortable in the saddle with each passing hour, the initial soreness of unfamiliar riding gradually giving way to a kind of numb endurance that let her focus more fully on watching the surrounding trees for any sign of danger, rather than simply enduring her own discomfort. It was on the second day, as the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, and the trail began winding through a narrower stretch of forest hemmed in by steep, rocky slopes on either side, that Ronan's careful alertness sharpened into something more urgent. He held up a hand, signaling Elira to stop, his head tilted slightly, as though listening for something just beyond the edge of ordinary hearing. "What is it?" Elira whispered, her own pulse quickening in response to his sudden tension. "Riders ahead," he said quietly. "More than one. And I don't like this stretch of trail. Too narrow, too easy to box us in from both sides." Even as he spoke, the sound of approaching hoofbeats became audible to Elira's own ears, multiple horses moving with the kind of coordinated purpose that suggested organized pursuit rather than simple travelers passing through. Ronan's expression hardened into the same focused readiness she had seen the night he first intervened in the border town's market square. "We need to turn back," he said, already wheeling his horse around. "This trail was supposed to be less traveled. If they knew to position themselves here, Someone gave them our route. The implication settled over Alira with cold clarity, even as they urged their horses back the way they had come, hooves pounding against the packed earth of the trail. Someone had betrayed their planned path, someone who knew enough about their intentions to position Damon's forces exactly where they would be most vulnerable. The traitor Ronan had suspected still operated somewhere within reach of information meant to remain secret. They had covered perhaps a quarter-mile back along the trail, when a second group of riders emerged from the tree line ahead of them, cutting off their retreat with the same coordinated precision that marked the group they had originally been fleeing. Alira's stomach dropped as she realized the trap had been closed from both directions, exactly as Ronan had feared. Off the trail, Ronan barked, already turning his horse toward the steep rocky slope rising to their left. We can't outrun them on open ground, but they'll have a harder time following through that terrain. Alira did not hesitate, following him up the difficult slope, even as she heard shouts rising from both groups of pursuers behind them, the sudden urgent calls of men who had just watched their careful trap begin to unravel. Her horse struggled against the steep, uneven ground, and she gripped the reins tightly, focusing every ounce of concentration on simply staying mounted as they scrambled upward through loose rock and scattered brush. A shout rang out closer behind them, followed by the whistle of something moving fast through the air, and Alira flinched instinctively as an arrow struck the trunk of a tree just ahead of her, close enough that she felt the disturbed air brush past her cheek. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs, fear sharpening every sense into painful clarity. "Keep moving," Ronan called back, not slowing his own pace despite the danger. "We're almost to the ridgeline. Once we're over, we'll have better cover." They pushed their horses harder, ignoring the animals' evident distress at the difficult terrain, until finally, they crested the ridge and found themselves looking down into a narrow valley, thick with dense forest, offering exactly the kind of cover Ronan had promised. They plunged down the far side of the ridge without pausing, putting the rise of stone and earth between themselves and their pursuers, at least for the moment. They rode hard through the valley below, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them, as the difficult terrain of the ridge slowed their pursuers' progress. But Alira knew, even as some of the immediate terror began to ease, that they had not truly escaped, only bought themselves a temporary reprieve that would not last long against riders determined enough to have set such a coordinated trap in the first place. "We need to find somewhere to hide the horses and continue on foot," Ronan said finally, once they had put sufficient distance between themselves and the ridge to risk slowing their pace. "They're tracking us by the horses' trail as much as anything else. If we can lose them on foot, even temporarily, it might buy enough time to reach Kale's people at the meeting point." They found a small, hidden hollow beneath an outcropping of rock where they could tether the horses out of immediate sight, and Ronan quickly gathered the most essential supplies from their packs, before leading Alira onward on foot, moving now with the careful, deliberate quiet of someone determined not to leave an easy trail to follow. The forest around them grew denser as they walked, the canopy overhead blocking much of the afternoon sunlight, casting the world in a dim, greenish light that made every shadow feel potentially threatening. They had been walking for perhaps an hour, moving as quickly and quietly as the difficult terrain allowed, when Alira's foot caught on a hidden root and she stumbled, catching herself against a nearby tree trunk with a small, sharp gasp of pain as her ankle twisted beneath her. Ronan was at her side immediately, his expression tight with concern, even as his eyes continued scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of pursuit. "Can you walk on it?" he asked quietly, crouching to examine the injury with careful hands. "I think so," Alira said, though the pain radiating up from her ankle suggested otherwise. "It just needs a moment." "We don't have a moment," Ronan said grimly, and even as he spoke, the distant sound of voices reached them through the trees, closer than Alira would have liked, the unmistakable sound of Damon's men, still searching, still closing the distance, despite their best efforts to disappear into the forest's depths. Ronan made a quick decision, wrapping one arm firmly around Alira's waist to help support her weight, guiding her forward at a pace that favored her injured ankle, while still maintaining as much speed as the circumstances allowed. They pushed onward through the forest, the sounds of pursuit ebbing and flowing behind them, as their pursuers apparently struggled to pin down their exact location, amid the dense, disorienting terrain. It was nearing dusk, the forest around them beginning to darken with the approach of evening, when they finally stumbled upon a small, fast-moving stream, that Ronan immediately recognized from some earlier scouting expedition through this region. "This leads toward the meeting point," he said, relief evident in his voice for the first time since the ambush had begun. "If we follow it, we should reach Kale's people before full dark." They followed the stream's winding course, through the deepening twilight, Alira leaning heavily against Ronan's supporting arm, her ankle throbbing with every step, despite her best efforts to ignore the pain. The sounds of pursuit had faded almost entirely now, whether because their pursuers had lost the trail or simply fallen back to regroup. Alira could not say for certain, but the relative silence offered at least a small measure of hope that they might actually reach safety before Damon's forces caught up to them again. Finally, as the last light of evening gave way to the deep blue of full darkness, they emerged from the tree line into a small clearing, where a cluster of tents and picketed horses marked the presence of a substantial armed camp, torchlight flickering warmly against the gathering night. A figure detached itself from the camp's perimeter guards and moved quickly toward them, and Alira felt a wave of relief, so powerful it nearly buckled her already unsteady knees, when she recognized her sister's familiar silhouette, rushing across the clearing to meet them. "Alira!" Seraphine's voice carried across the distance, raw with relief and worry, in equal measure, and within moments, she had reached them, wrapping her arms around her sister with a fierceness that spoke of days of accumulated fear, finally finding release. "I'm here," Alira murmured against her sister's shoulder, exhaustion and relief mingling into something that made her voice unsteady. "I'm sorry, Seraphine. I should have come to you rather than running. You can explain everything once you're safe, and that ankle is properly tended to," Seraphine said, pulling back just enough to examine her sister's face with obvious concern, before glancing toward Ronan with a grateful nod. "Thank you for bringing her back safely." "The danger isn't over," Ronan said grimly, even as camp guards moved to help support Alira toward the nearest tent. "Damon's men were close behind us. They may still be tracking our trail toward this camp." As if summoned by his words, a shout rang out from the camp's perimeter, followed by the sudden, urgent clash of steel meeting steel, and Alira's brief moment of relief shattered instantly into fresh terror as she realized their pursuers had indeed followed them, and that whatever safety this camp had promised was about to be tested by exactly the violent confrontation they had spent the last 2 days desperately trying to avoid. The camp erupted into controlled chaos as Kale's guards moved swiftly to meet the sudden incursion, torches casting wild, flickering shadows across the clearing as shouted orders cut through the night air. Ronan immediately pushed Alira and Seraphine toward the center of the camp, away from the perimeter where the fighting had broken out, his own blade drawn now, his earlier careful composure replaced by the sharp focus of a man prepared to defend the people under his protection. "Stay close to the central tent," he instructed both sisters firmly. "Kale's personal guard will hold that position no matter what happens at the perimeter." Alira's ankle throbbed with every hurried step, but adrenaline dulled the worst of the pain as Seraphine helped support her weight, both of them moving as quickly as the circumstances allowed toward the relative safety Ronan had indicated. Around them, the camp's defenders were clearly proving more than capable of holding their ground, years of training and discipline evident in the coordinated way they responded to the sudden attack, pushing Damon's smaller raiding party back toward the tree line, even as more guards rushed to reinforce the perimeter. They had nearly reached the central tent when Kale himself emerged, having clearly been alerted the moment the attack began, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and controlled authority as he took in the scene before him. His eyes found Alira immediately, relief flooding his features for just a moment before the demands of the unfolding crisis pulled his attention back to the tactical situation surrounding them. "Get them inside," he ordered the nearest guards, moving to personally usher his fiancée and the woman whose absence had driven him to mobilize an entire camp of armed protection toward the tent's relative safety. "I need a full report on our perimeter status. Now." The fighting, though intense, proved mercifully brief. Damon's raiding party, having clearly expected to catch a small, vulnerable group rather than a fully mobilized camp of the king's personal guard, quickly recognized the impossibility of their position and began a hasty retreat back into the surrounding forest, harried by pursuing guards determined to ensure they did not simply regroup for a second attempt. Within a quarter hour, the camp's perimeter guards reported the immediate threat had been repelled, though several among Damon's attacking force had been captured rather than allowed to escape back to their leader. Inside the central tent, Alira finally allowed herself to sink onto a low camp stool, her adrenaline beginning to fade and leave behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple movement feel like an enormous effort. Seraphine knelt beside her immediately, examining her injured ankle with careful, practiced hands, while a camp healer was summoned to properly assess the damage. "You've had quite a journey," Kale said quietly, entering the tent once he was satisfied the immediate danger had passed, his eyes settling on Alira with an expression she found difficult to read, a complicated mixture of relief, guilt, and something else she could not quite name. "That's one way to describe it," Alira said, managing a weak, exhausted smile despite everything. "I didn't expect running from your secret would lead to actual arrows being shot at me." Kale's expression sobered further. "I owe you an apology, Alira. A far more thorough one than I've had the chance to offer. My handling of this entire situation, from the moment I decided to marry Seraphine, for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine partnership, to the way my careless words in a private conversation put you in danger you never should have faced, all of it reflects poorly on my judgment, as both a man and a king." "You don't need to apologize to me," Alira said, though something in his sincerity made the words land differently than she expected, softening some of the anger and fear she had carried since first overhearing his secret. "I understand better now why you made the choices you did. That doesn't mean they were the right choices, but I understand the fear behind them. That doesn't excuse the danger my choices put you in," Kale said firmly. "Whatever comes next, I intend to make this right, starting with ensuring Damon can never again use this secret as a weapon against my kingdom, or the people within it." "How do you intend to do that?" Seraphine asked, looking up from her examination of Alira's ankle, her own expression thoughtful and calculating, in a way that reminded Alira of the sharp, capable sister she had always known, lay beneath Seraphine's carefully composed exterior. Kale was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I think the only way to truly neutralize this threat is to remove its power entirely. Secrets only hold danger, as long as they remain hidden, weapons waiting to be wielded by whoever controls the information. If I bring the truth of my birth before the full council myself, on my own terms, rather than allowing Damon to expose it as a weapon against me, I remove his leverage entirely." "That's an enormous risk," Ronan said, entering the tent in time to hear his brother's proposal, his expression troubled. "The council could still use it as grounds to challenge your legitimacy, regardless of how the truth comes to light." "Perhaps," Kale acknowledged. "But I've spent my entire reign building alliances, maintaining peace between our territories, working to ensure the stability and prosperity of everyone within my kingdom's borders. I have to believe that record of governance matters more to the council than the circumstances of my birth, circumstances I had no control over and never asked to inherit." Alira watched him as he spoke, seeing beneath the careful, measured tone of a king, weighing difficult political calculations, to something more vulnerable underneath, a man finally choosing to release the burden of secrecy he had carried since the age of 16, trading the fragile protection of hidden truth for the harder, more uncertain path of honest transparency. "I think you're right," she said quietly, drawing his attention back to her. "Secrets like this only grow more dangerous the longer they're kept hidden. I understand that better now than I did when I first ran from your study door." Kale's expression softened as he looked at her, something passing between them that felt different from the careful, distant politeness that had characterized their previous interactions. "I owe you more than an apology for that, Alira. If you hadn't overheard what you did, I might have continued hiding behind careful lies indefinitely, building a marriage and a political strategy on a foundation I knew was fundamentally dishonest. In a strange way, your discovery forced a reckoning I should have faced years ago." The camp healer arrived then, interrupting the moment with practical necessity, examining Alira's ankle with brisk efficiency, before declaring it a bad sprain rather than a break, wrapping it securely, and instructing her to rest, and avoid putting weight on it for at least several days. As the healer worked, Seraphine watched the exchange between Kale and her sister with an expression Alira could not quite read, something thoughtful and considering, rather than jealous or hurt. "We should discuss what happens next," Seraphine said, once the healer had finished and departed, her voice carrying the same practical steadiness she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Damon's forces retreated tonight, but he won't simply give up his ambitions after a single failed attempt. If you truly intend to bring this truth before the council, Kale, We need to plan carefully how and when that revelation happens, to minimize whatever political fallout follows. Agreed, Kale said, something like renewed determination settling over his features. Tomorrow, once everyone has had proper rest, we'll begin planning our approach. But tonight, I think we've all earned a chance to simply breathe and recover from everything that's happened. As the tent gradually emptied, guards and advisors dispersing to attend to their various duties throughout the camp, Elira found herself alone for a moment with Seraphine, the sisters sitting together in comfortable, exhausted silence that carried none of the old distance and competition that had shaped so much of their relationship before this ordeal began. "I'm sorry I never told you what I overheard," Elira said finally, breaking the silence. "You deserve to know the truth from the start, rather than learning it secondhand after I'd already run." "I understand why you didn't," Seraphine said, reaching over to squeeze her sister's hand gently. "You were protecting yourself from an impossible situation, one none of us should have placed you in to begin with. If anything, I'm grateful you cared enough about the consequences to run, rather than simply stay silent and let me walk blindly into a marriage built on lies." The two sisters sat together as the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of nighttime watch, and Elira felt something shift between them, a fragile but genuine closeness beginning to form from the wreckage of a crisis neither of them had chosen, but both had been forced to navigate. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited them as Kale prepared to reveal his secret before the full council, Elira understood that she would not face it alone, that the family she had once felt so distant from had proven, in the end, far more resilient and loyal than she had ever dared to hope. The council chamber had never felt so full of tension as it did on the morning Kale chose to reveal his secret, every seat occupied by pack leaders and advisors summoned from across the kingdom, their expressions ranging from curious to openly suspicious, as rumors of some significant announcement had already begun circulating in the days since the failed attack on the king's camp. Elira stood near the back of the chamber alongside Seraphine and Ronan, her ankles still wrapped and tender, but well enough to bear her weight for the short duration the ceremony required. Kale stood before the assembled council with the same steady composure Elira had always associated with him, though she now understood the careful effort that composure required, the years of practiced control that allowed him to mask uncertainty behind a calm, authoritative exterior. He waited until the chamber had fully quieted before beginning to speak, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I have called this council together to share a truth I have carried alone for far too long," he began. "A truth that some among you may already suspect, given recent events, and one that I believe deserves to be heard directly from me, rather than through the distorted whispers of those who would use it as a weapon against this kingdom's stability." A ripple of murmured speculation moved through the assembled council members, quickly silenced as Kale continued, laying out the truth of his birth with the same careful, measured honesty he had first shared with Seraphine in the manor's private garden. He spoke of his mother's affair, of his true father's identity remaining unknown even to himself, of the man he had always called father, choosing to raise him regardless of the circumstances of his birth. He spoke, too, of the fear that had driven him to guard this secret so fiercely, the belief that its exposure would inevitably weaken his claim to rule. "I share this with you now, openly and without the protection of secrecy, because I have come to understand that hidden truths only grow more dangerous the longer they remain buried," he said, his eyes moving across the assembled faces with steady resolve. "I would rather face whatever judgment this council renders with complete honesty than continue building my reign on a foundation of careful lies that leave me vulnerable to anyone willing to use this truth as leverage against the peace and stability we have all worked so hard to build." The silence that followed his words stretched long and uncertain, and Elira found herself holding her breath, watching the faces of council members she did not know well enough to predict their reactions. Finally, an older woman near the front of the chamber rose from her seat, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "You have ruled this kingdom for years, with wisdom and fairness that few among your predecessors could match," she said, her voice carrying the weight of long experience. "The circumstances of your birth were never something you controlled, and I, for one, do not believe they diminish the legitimacy you have earned through your actual governance." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, though not universal, several council members exchanging uncertain glances that suggested the matter would not resolve itself without further debate and negotiation in the days ahead. But the immediate crisis, the fear of sudden, chaotic exposure that Damon had hoped to exploit, had been effectively diffused by Cale's own choice to control the narrative through honest disclosure, rather than allow it to be weaponized against him. In the weeks that followed, the political fallout proved manageable, if not entirely without difficulty. Several council members initially pushed for formal challenges to Cale's succession, but the majority, swayed by his years of demonstrated competence and the genuine respect he had earned through fair governance, ultimately voted to affirm his continued rule. Damon, deprived of the secret weapon he had hoped to wield, found his own position considerably weakened among the Eastern pacts, several of his previous allies quietly distancing themselves from his aggressive ambitions once the element of surprise and leverage had been stripped away. Elira remained at Draven Manor throughout this period of uncertainty, her ankle slowly healing, her relationship with both her sister and the kingdom's uncertain future evolving in ways she could not have predicted when she first slipped out through the manor's side gate before dawn. She found herself spending increasing amounts of time in conversation with Cale, discussions that began as practical matters related to the ongoing political situation, but gradually deepened into something more personal, an easy comfort growing between them that neither had expected from the circumstances of their initial, dangerous introduction to each other's deepest vulnerabilities. Seraphine, for her part, approached the shifting dynamics with the same practical grace she brought to everything else, eventually admitting to her sister, during one of their now regular evening conversations, that she had never truly loved Cale in the way their engagement had suggested, that her own feelings had always been rooted more in duty and practical alliance than genuine romantic affection. "I think I always sensed something was missing," Seraphine confided one evening, the two sisters sitting together in the manor's private garden where Cale had first confessed his secret to her. "I just didn't have the courage to examine it too closely, not when everyone around me seemed so certain this marriage was exactly what I should want." "What do you want now?" Elira asked gently, watching her sister's face in the fading evening light. Seraphine considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful, rather than troubled. "I think I want the chance to choose my own path forward, rather than simply accepting whatever role the kingdom's politics assign to me. Cale has already spoken with me about ending our engagement amicably, allowing both of us the freedom to pursue paths that better reflect what we actually want, rather than what circumstances once demanded." The engagement's quiet dissolution, when it finally became public knowledge, caused far less scandal than either sister had initially feared, the council and wider kingdom already having absorbed the larger shock of Cale's revealed parentage with relative equanimity. Seraphine, freed from the weight of an obligation she had never truly chosen for herself, began exploring interests she had long set aside in favor of her expected role as future queen, eventually finding purpose in establishing a mediation council designed to help resolve disputes between neighboring pacts before they escalated into open conflict, work that suited her natural diplomatic gifts far better than the largely ceremonial role of consort had ever promised to. For Elira, the months following the crisis brought their own quiet transformation. What had begun as a desperate flight from a secret too dangerous to hold gradually evolved into something she could never have anticipated on that cold morning she slipped through the manor's side gate before dawn. Cale, freed from the careful political calculations that had once defined his approach to marriage and partnership, found himself drawn to Elira not out of strategic necessity, but genuine, uncomplicated affection, a connection built on the shared trust and vulnerability that had first formed during the dangerous days of her flight and his desperate search to bring her safely home. "I never expected any of this," Elira admitted to him one evening, the two of them walking together through the same garden, where so much of this story's crucial turning points had unfolded. "I thought I was simply running from a secret too heavy to carry. I never imagined it would lead me here." "Life rarely follows the paths we expect," Cale replied, something warm and genuine in his voice that Elira had come to treasure over the months since the crisis first began. "I spent years believing that protecting my secret required distance, careful calculation, a marriage built on strategy rather than trust. It took nearly losing everything, nearly losing you, to Damon's ambitions, to understand how wrong that belief truly was." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the garden's fountain murmuring softly in the background. The weight of secrets and danger that had once defined their relationship now settled into something steadier and more hopeful. Elira thought back to that terrified young woman who had fled before dawn, carrying a secret she believed would destroy everything around her if it ever came to light. She could never have imagined, in that moment of fear and uncertainty, that the very act of running would ultimately lead her toward a life built on far greater honesty and connection than she had ever known before. The kingdom, too, found its own new equilibrium in the months that followed. Cale's transparent handling of his own vulnerable truth, setting a precedent that gradually shifted the culture of secrecy and careful political calculation that had long defined relationships between the various pacts and territories. Trust, once so carefully guarded and rationed, began flowing more freely between former rivals, alliances built on genuine partnership rather than fear-based leverage, slowly replacing the older, more brittle arrangements that had defined the kingdom's politics for generations. Elira never forgot the fear of that first night, crouched outside Cale's study door, overhearing words she was never meant to hear. But looking back from the vantage point of the peaceful, honest life she had ultimately built, she understood that sometimes the most frightening truths, once finally brought into the light rather than buried in careful secrecy, held the power to transform, not just individual lives but entire kingdoms, replacing the fragile architecture of hidden fear with something far sturdier and more enduring, the simple, hard-won strength of honesty, freely chosen, rather than truth reluctantly discovered.